Got that going. Welcome everyone to this webinar. We're so excited to have you today for this presentation. We're going to do some introductions and then move into our presentation with Dr. Sara Awartani. So I want to start by introducing myself. My name is or Loren Ileana Sotolongo, and I'm a queer and trans Cuban American poet and scholar. And I'm so honored to be hosting this conversation today as the president of Latinx Seminarians at Vanderbilt Divinity School. So now we'll intro our featured person today. Dr. Sara Awartani is an LSA Collegiate Fellow and Assistant Professor in the Department of American Culture at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. An interdisciplinary historian, her research, publications, and teaching focuses on 20th century US social movements, interracial solidarities, policing, and histories of the United States and the world, with special attention to Latinx and Arab American radicalisms. Her first book, project, tentatively titled Solidarities of Liberation, Visions of Empire, Puerto Rico, Palestine, and American Global Power, under contract with University of North Carolina Press, chronicles a globally expansive story of Palestine liberation, Puerto Rican radicalism, and the United States' efforts to weaponize and police those freedom dreams. Her articles have appeared in a variety of peer-reviewed journals and public-facing forums, including Radical History Review, CALFO, a comparative ethnic studies journal, Society and Space, Intervenciones Against the Current, and Middle East Report, with a chapter in Critical Dialogues in Latinx Studies, a reader. Before joining Michigan, she was a Global American Studies postdoctoral fellow at Harvard University's Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History and a lecturer on Harvard's Committee on Ethnicity, Migration, Rights. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Awartani. We're so excited to have you. And I'd like to introduce our other professor and scholar in this conversation, who will be a part of the discussion after Dr. Awartani's presentation. So we have our very own Dr. Yara Gonzalez Justiniano, who is an assistant professor of religion, psychology, and culture with an emphasis in Latinx studies at Vanderbilt University. She is also affiliated faculty of the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx Studies. Her most recent publication, Centering Hope as a Sustainable Decolonial Practice, Esperanza en Práctica, wrestles with answering the question of what hope looks like amid socioeconomic crisis. Her interdisciplinary approach to this inquiry grounds itself in ethnographic research in hopes of finding practices that enable a hope that can sustain the collective. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Gonzalez Justiniano. We're so excited to have you. So let's get started. Dr. Awartani, I'd like to invite you into the space to lead it as you will for this teach-in section. And yeah, we're so excited to hear from you.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. This is really beautiful. I feel like I've done a lot of panels on like US policy, and they're very, they're not rooted in community. So this feels far more warm and welcoming and generative. So I'm excited to be with you. I'm going to do my best to share my screen. I may flop, so if I do, bear with me. I'm not good at technology. Let's see, share screen. Did I do it? Is that functioning? Beautiful. Okay, well, again, thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor to be in community with you all today. I know that we're both existing on campuses that are contentious, as many of us are, kind of across the state. So to be in community and to think with each other and to think generatively and generously is really beautiful. So I'm going to go ahead and get started so that we have as much time for conversation afterwards as possible. So since October 7th, an unprecedented number of Puerto Ricans across the archipelago and the diaspora have taken to the streets to organize and march in solidarity with Palestinians. Whether calling for a ceasefire to halt Israel's siege on Gaza or demanding the liberation of Palestine, many Puerto Ricans describe being called to action because Puerto Rico, like Palestine, faces a similar struggle against colonialism. There is a situation of humanitarian crisis and genocide. there are clear intentions of racial extermination, explained Ricardo Santos Ortiz, the spokesman for Puerto Rico's Palestine Solidarity Network. Therefore, we see as urgent the solidarity from the people, the entire world, and Puerto Rico, which is also a colonized and intervened country. So journalists have clamored to explain this uptick in pro-Palestinian sentiment among Puerto Ricans. Oh, now am I doing it right? There we go. And their reports paint Puerto Rico and Palestine as parallel struggles. Quote, at this juncture, it is imperative to address the self-determination of people in Palestine. If so, we must also speak about Puerto Rico, the world's oldest colony, writes one reporter. The similarities, she later goes on to explain, are too many to ignore. But Israel's violence against Gaza calls us to uncover not just historic parallels between Puerto Rico and Palestine, but to also uncover the long history of Puerto Rican solidarities with Palestine. So these solidarities, much like that of the Black and Palestinian left, were birthed in the aftermath of the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, and were rooted in a broader politics of anti-imperialism and left internationalism. Even more importantly, the most robust of these solidarities were rooted in the militant politics of the most radical sectors of the Puerto Rican left, those committed to achieving Puerto Rican decolonization through any means necessary, including the use of armed struggle. So it is a story, which is kind of what I've been saying to folks these past few months, that inevitably leads us to an unlikely place for many, but is Puerto Rican Chicago. So much of this history of solidarity can be traced back to the Armed Forces of National Liberation, or FALN, a clandestine organization largely based out of Chicago, though its members also stemmed from New York and the archipelago itself, committed to achieving Puerto Rican independence through armed struggle. Across their headline-grabbing and controversial lifespan, the FALN launched over 100 attacks throughout the United States in an attempt to show the world that Puerto Rico is a colony. Among Puerto Rican and other New Left radicals who remained committed to these kinds of revolutionary politics, the FALN was a legitimate national liberation movement fighting for self-determination against an imperial power. They understood the fight against US colonialism in Puerto Rico as part of a global history of third world liberation. And it was in this kind of global struggle that the FALN believed that Puerto Rico and Palestine were linked together, that they were part and parcel of the same revolutionary struggle. So much like historian Robin Kelley writes of Black Palestinian solidarities, what mattered most to Chicago's Puerto Rican radicals was less any precise parallels between Puerto Rico and Palestine than the insistence that, quote, the struggles were linked not only to each other, but to injustice and oppression around the world. This was very much the case for Puerto Rican political prisoner Edwin Cortez, and I'll kind of walk through a bit of his life in this story.
Dr. Awartani,
yes.
Sorry, did you want to make the slides full screen there?
Are they not full screen?
No.
Oh no, all this time.
That's okay.
Okay, tell me how I do that.
I believe if you click the slideshow in the right-hand corner, there should be an option.
So I see it full screen on my computer.
Oh.
That's why I'm confused.
It's not, I don't know if you hit play. So the thing that we can see, not as a presentation, but as if it were watching a PDF document. So
bless my heart. Okay.
Yes.
I told you. So if I do, now is it working?
No. So maybe if you go like on the top of the screen, I just don't know if it's your left or your right next to the share button.
Yeah.
Slideshow next to it. Share slideshow. There you go.
Now is it working? That's what I did before.
Huh. It's not.
Maybe look
maybe
at the arrow that goes down. See what happens.
Presenter view. Start from the beginning. Do you want? Let me stop the screen share and start. Let's try that. Sorry, y'all.
It's all right.
Of course this would happen. Okay, let's do desktop 1. Or let's do this screen only. Now is it?
It's
Still
still showing that.
The main like web page.
Yeah. Which is odd. But, I mean, we could do that, and you know, I can still see it. It's
Wait. Now can you see it?
Oh, yes. Okay.
Okay,
And
so I had to share the full desktop and not just the page. You know what? It's fine.
yes. And were you advancing slides as you needed to?
I was
Okay,
advancing slides.
Perfect. We just didn't see it. So that's great. You were doing your job. The internet was not doing its job. So go ahead.
I apologize. There was this beautiful slide with some headlines. This is a slide where it's from a document from the journals that were published in the struggle to free the political prisoners. So this is announcing a bombing that was done in solidarity with Palestinians. I will resume. Apology for the chaos. Okay, so back to Edwin Cortez. So Edwin Cortez, arrested in 1983 for his alleged involvement with the FALN and charged with seditious conspiracy, he stayed abreast of political developments across Palestine throughout his years behind bars. For example, with the onset of the First Intifada, Cortez found himself compelled to write a defense of the Palestinian struggle. Excuse me. And now you all can see the slides beautifully. There we go. It works eventually. Published in Libertad, the official journal of the campaign to free the Puerto Rican political prisoners, Cortez wrote, quote, "Within the past 2 months, renewed resistance in the Middle East has once again captured world attention. This time, it is not the tragic Iran-Iraq war, but Palestine, a nation in struggle that represents a vital threat to the existence of Zionism, Arab reaction, and US imperialism in the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip," end quote. He warned Libertad's readers to refuse the US and Israeli media's attempts to cast the uprisings as temporary civil unrest caused by outside agitators. Nothing could be further from the truth, insisted Cortez. Rather, these, quote, "massive acts of resistance by a wide spectrum of Palestinians are led by genuine and experienced indigenous leadership," end quote. As such, Cortez called Libertad's readers to listen, center, and trust Palestinian voices in their movement work. Quote, "The task of progressive and freedom-loving people, national liberation movements, and socialist countries is to concretely and materially support the Palestinian people's uprising, their right to self-determination, and the establishment of a Palestinian state," he explained. Excuse me. But tracing this long and partial history through the story of former political prisoner Edwin Cortez can enrich the archive of Puerto Rican Palestinian solidarities even further. Indeed, as I've written elsewhere, Chicago's Puerto Rican radicals stood in solidarity with Palestine, not only out of this kind of shared ideological commitment to revolutionary struggle and third world liberation, but also out of very specific shared organizing histories in Chicago. So in the 1970s, both Puerto Rican and Palestinian Chicago found themselves consistently monitored by local and federal authorities, the former as part of a broader federal investigation into the Puerto Rican independence movement, and the latter in response to Palestinian terrorism, and I'm emphasizing scare quotes, including the Nixon administration's Operation Boulder, which was a federal program dedicated to monitoring, interrogating, and deporting Arab and Arab Americans deemed suspicious of terrorist activities. So it was these mutual experiences of state surveillance and political repression that helped bring Puerto Ricans and Palestinians in Chicago together. And this was especially true among student activists at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And this is the piece that speaks to that. There, they would face additional repression from a university administration hostile to progressive movement building, especially toward Palestine solidarity movements. And so while the story of repression against student organizing is best told elsewhere, though I'm happy to speak more, it remains a foundational moment in the long history of Puerto Rican Palestinian solidarities. Edwin Cortez himself later reflected, and he tells the story often if you ask him, that organizing alongside Palestinian and other third world student movements were critical to his own political trajectory. Quote, "It was at the university that I became aware and involved in other third world people's liberation struggles. I met and became personal friends with members of the Organization of Arab Students," end quote. So to trace this long history of Puerto Rican solidarities with Palestine back to Puerto Rican Chicago might be controversial to some, right? This is a difficult history to contend with. At the height of their political activity, 1974 to 1983, not everyone viewed the FALN as a legitimate national liberation movement. Surely the United States government did not. And also, as an aside, this political cartoon was one of the first documents I found when I started this research my senior year of college. So to the United States and also to the Puerto Rican government itself, the FALN was a terrorist organization, and Chicago's Puerto Rican community still struggles to distance itself from these kinds of accusations of terrorism and anti-Americanism to this day. The FALN also drew skepticism among other factions of the Puerto Rican left, the most well-known of these divisions being the rumor that the FALN was actually just an FBI operative meant to destroy the Puerto Rican independence movement internally. But the long history of Puerto Rican solidarities with Palestine can't be divorced from these radical protest traditions. And that's because the story of Puerto Rican solidarities with Palestine, much like the story of much like the story of Puerto Rican Chicago, is also a story of the United States' efforts to cast the independence movement as a terrorist and therefore as an illegitimate political movement. And this is, of course, a story that Palestinians themselves know all too well. So by way of conclusion, and this is kind of a lengthy conclusion in the way that scholars do, I'd like to turn our attention to a very different, though hopefully, as you will see, related historical moment. Dear Puerto Ricans, thus opens a letter published on October 3rd, 2017, in the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Maria by a young woman in Gaza. News of Puerto Rico's devastation and the neglectful response by the Trump administration had already reverberated across the globe. In her letter, she recalls reading and bearing witness to this devastation. The more I read about the way the hurricane has devastated Puerto Rico, she reflects, the more parallels I see to Gaza after a war, or actually even now. She found herself compelled to action. Indeed, in Puerto Rico, it seemed she saw herself. Quote, I know what it's like to struggle with shortages of vital supplies such as electricity, gas, cash, and safe water. I know what it's like to lose everything and have no place to go. I know what it feels like to hope that help will come and it doesn't. That's why I'm writing this letter, to express my solidarity with all of you who are struggling to survive the damage wrought first by years of neglect and now by the furies of Hurricane Maria. It breaks my heart to know that the same crises that make life so difficult every day in Gaza, although here they are very much man-made, now are hurting you in Puerto Rico, end quote. So from her perspective, we learn that Puerto Ricans and Palestinians, specifically Palestinians in Gaza, are quote unquote partners in crisis. Because we have so much experience already, she explains, Here are some tips to help you cope. Her letter moves to offer tangible material, emotional, and psychological support to her Puerto Rican counterparts, a narration of resistance that demands the violence of colonialism to be named. For example, while warning Puerto Ricans that they will have no clean water while awaiting the US government to restore the island's electricity, she states, quote, I read that the US Federal Emergency Management Agency had estimated that 42% of Puerto Ricans are without access to potable water, and that just 9% of the island's and just 9 of the island's 52 wastewater treatment facilities are operational. In Gaza, less than 4% of our water is drinkable. We know how dangerous it is to drink contaminated water, end quote. In another moment, she offers advice on navigating long lines for fuel. Many times, we also have to spend an entire day waiting for fuel when our supply from Egypt and Israel is cut off, she commiserates. Bring snacks, she suggests, and friends, quote, good friends ease the suffering of waiting, end quote. And while her letter is at times lighthearted in its sincerity, she is continuously aware that even as Puerto Ricans and Palestinians face similar realities, that these realities are still not exactly the same. I hope most of you managed to collect your most valuable possessions before you had to flee, unlike most of us who didn't, she tells Puerto Ricans forced to evacuate their homes after a dam damaged by Hurricane Maria failed. 10 minutes is a very short time to try and recall every memory you had inside your house, she laments of her own experiences evacuating buildings targeted by Israeli missiles. We take our identity cards and go out to die a million times to watch gazillions of memories wiped out like they never existed. So the first time I presented this story of this letter was at the 2018 National Women's Studies Association conference. In my concluding remarks, I offered the audience an invitation. Quote, amid these expressions of solidarity, heart-wrenching and poignant as they are, we are reminded, or perhaps better yet, we are compelled to ask, that this was not the first generation of activists to trace the colonial logics between Israel and the United States, nor to forge co-constitutive movement building between Puerto Rican and Palestinian struggles for self-determination, end quote. So of course, I meant this as a simple rhetorical device. I thought it was a clever way for me as a scholar, especially a then PhD candidate, to explain my talk's relevance to my larger dissertation project. But instead, a beautiful thing happened. There we go. A woman in the audience slipped me a note, and I tried to block out her name, but clearly failed. Unfortunately, I have to go, but would love to connect to continue solidarity building, it read. The author, as it turned out, was an activist from Puerto Rico. Her note explained how she knew many of the Puerto Rican activists shown in my presentation slides, including some of those former political prisoners. If you need anything, don't hesitate to contact me, as I want to help as much as possible, she wrote. So this note remained taped to my wall by my desk as I completed my dissertation in Washington, D.C., and again later in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where I revised for the first draft of the book manuscript. Its ink now well faded from the sun. It served as a reminder of the longer history of solidarity that my book and this talk seeks to uncover. But it was also a reminder that as much as this work is an exercise in academic scholarship, its importance resonates far beyond the ivory tower and the discipline of history, especially a discipline whose rigorous and kind of traditional archival demands often threaten to render these stories of solidarities both untenable and unimportant, which, as we know today, nearly 6 months into the siege on Gaza, could not be further from the truth. So as a movement historian of the ethnic and Latinx studies traditions, it would be uncharacteristic of me to conclude my time with you all today without affirming the importance of endurance movement work. So allow me to end then with the words of Palestinian American writer and poet Hala Al-Yan. She reminds us that, quote, "We belong to long, gorgeous lineages of endurance. We are all here because someone, somewhere endured. When it feels impossible, find land, find breath, find each other, find songs and poems of endurance. Seek out the journalists, the healers, the historians. This feeling of despair, of rage, of unreality is what helps us seek and preserve truth. This feeling doesn't have to be turned into anything other than what is to be endured." So thank you all so much, especially for bearing with my major technical difficulties.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. We're going to move into some discussion now. And yeah, I mean, there were so many parts of the presentation that have stuck with me. And the quote where you took from that letter of the Palestinian, the person in Gaza, saying 10 minutes is a very short time to recall every memory you had inside your house, was so powerful. So in terms of a couple questions, we'll start with a couple for you and then engage Dr. Gonzalez Justiniano too in the conversation.
Absolutely.
So yeah, first, in terms of lineage and archive, why were you drawn to this work today as an interdisciplinary historian from your own experience? And do you have any memories of childhood or growing up that led you to the work you do now?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. So my mother's Puerto Rican, my father's Palestinian. I'm born and raised in Gainesville, Florida. Obligatory Go Gators, even though I'm sure nobody here cares about sports. But I'm morally obligated, even though UF is a hot ass mess. But I grew up really in a community and in a family that was struggling to assimilate. So I didn't learn Spanish or Arabic growing up. And college, the kind of quintessential ethnic studies story was the first time I took a class on the history of Puerto Rico. And it obviously changed my life. It had me rethinking the reasons that my parents made certain decisions. It was really eye-opening. And so I was just like, well, what would happen if I compared Puerto Rico and Palestine? What might come of that? What might I learn from myself or about myself, especially since I can't access familial histories in the same way because I need somebody to translate for me. And so I Googled Puerto Rico and Palestine, like any good undergraduate student does. And I've written about this recently, but yeah, a number of things popped up. One was that political cartoon that showed, others were stories of these political prisoners really trying to think about solidarity with Palestine. But it was a very slim archive. And so to do this work has been difficult in a number of ways and feels very different than this moment where we're seeing solidarity on kind of a mass scale in very beautiful ways. But it was really a personal journey. I just felt compelled, in the best way that an undergraduate education will let you, to really ask questions about myself, that then opened up this history that is far from anything I would have encountered in my own upbringing and brought me into a community who thankfully has trusted me to kind of tell these stories and help tell these stories.
Thank you for that. Yeah. One of the things too, as you were presenting and that I've been noticing in your work, I'm curious about what drew you to connect Puerto Rican, solidarity with Palestine through the FALN and Puerto Rican Chicago, mainly because, when folks are talking to general audiences about these movements, a lot of people like to point to nonviolent movements or actors, but there's the hesitation to draw on the history of any armed struggles, which are labeled, as you said, quote unquote terrorist by colonial powers in their response to colonial violence. So yeah, like what was the draw there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was purely a matter of what was in the archive, right? Like this was what I was able to access. I had a undergraduate advisor who, you know, when I proposed this idea, she was like, you know, of all of the Puerto Rican movements, I bet it would be this group from Chicago. Or, you know, I'm claiming they're from Chicago. They're more or less from Chicago. She was like, I bet it would be this organization that's committed to armed struggle. So I ended up writing my undergraduate thesis on the FALN, and it was just kind of a movement history. And what, and part of, and I wasn't able to do the work I wanted to as an undergrad, but I found letters by the political prisoners and they were thinking about Palestine.
Mm.
And like I gestured in the talk, like this is a complicated history to contend with a group of people who choose to pursue violent means, even if it is a deliberate decision to target property over civilians. Like there's a kind of clear distinction in their ideology. And to try and make sense of like what would drive a community to do that. What was the political atmosphere of the 70s and 80s that would help make legible those kinds of acts, right? This is an era of third world decolonization where you see the colonized uprising against their colonizers. But I was also really interested in the fact that once the political prisoners are released in 99, or the majority of them are released in 99, they're granted clemency. The conversation in Congress is all about what does this mean for our fight against terrorism? What does this mean for the way we are going to approach organizations in the Middle East? There's something here. There's something about the way we have been taught to understand the Puerto Rican independence movement, this group in particular, right? Like I was encouraged throughout graduate school to not write about the FALN. I was told by folks to perhaps write about the Puerto Rican Socialist Party because their politics were more sound and therefore their solidarities would be more sound. But that's not where the archive took me, right? And if we want to trouble the archive in many ways that are important, it's also telling us something significant, that this group made this effort to link their struggle, the struggle with Puerto Rico, to all of these, a number of third world movements. And so what was legible about Palestine, or what felt legible about Palestine, but also why was it so threatening to the state that these comparisons were being made, right? So part of the dissertation and now the book manuscript is really trying to take seriously that as much as like these activists were comparing their movements with Palestine, with Algeria, with a number of spaces, the United States government was paying attention, and it was mobilizing similar comparisons in order to implement kind of new regimes of policing. So that's the flip side, right? That the state, it matters to how, you know, the state has moved to police movements in their entirety.
Thank you. That was a really, really wonderful answer to think through. I'm curious, this is an aside question that I didn't think about before, but curious what support looked like in scholarly space, you know, as we're in this moment of processing a lot of support or lack thereof in talking about these things. What did that look like, or has that looked like for your work for this archival work?
Yeah, that's that's hard. I'll tread carefully in answering that. You know, I think that grad school is a traumatic experience for many of us. I remember I had a wonderful advisor who I loved dearly, you know, trained me to be a movement historian, which I didn't anticipate becoming when I started graduate school. I thought I would kind of go a different direction. And there was a concern with, is there enough archival material? Is there enough archival material? Do you have enough to write, you know, in the practical sense of like, you got to get in and out of this program. Can you do this work? And so that was kind of the conversation in the graduate program. But I met early on folks from Chicago. I had the chance to publish in Radical History Review. And one of the editors there was Margaret Cower, who was a historian, or is a historian, has now retired from her position, but also a long-term solidarity activist, right? And so she was my entry into the community. I met early on other scholars from Puerto Rican Chicago as well. And they were all just very insistent that there was a story here, that you might not be finding the story in the archive, in the traditional archive, but that it mattered to the community in certain ways. And I remember the summer I started my dissertation research, like in real seriousness. I had arrived in Chicago, and it was right after Oscar Lopez was released. And there was a ceremony where Rasmia Ode gives him a kafia, right? And it's printed in like the pages of the community newspaper in Puerto Rican Chicago. And like I walked into the house and somebody handed it to me and was like, this is a story. Like, this is a story. Here's your evidence. Here's what you take back to your advisor and convince them that like this wouldn't happen if there wasn't a longer kind of trajectory happening in Chicago. Because as much as it's the story of this movement with these complicated politics, it's also about Chicago and the ways that people were, you know, experiencing racism and discrimination and the struggle for education and the way folks are thinking about policing and surveillance in very particular material ways. And so it really, I think, as the course of the project developed, became a story about Chicago championed by folks in Chicago who, like I said, embraced me into their community, even though I'm like this little Puerto Rican girl from Gainesville, Florida, with a vaguely Southern accent, who were like, you know, what is she doing here? So I take really seriously that responsibility, right? Like I have little notes on my computer, and it's like, tell a story that matters to Puerto Rican Chicago. Like, who cares if the rest of the academy doesn't like it, but if like you write something that makes folks feel seen and tells that story, then that's what got me through all the mess that is grad school and the traditions of, you know, what is expected of a dissertation and what's okay to write about versus not. Yeah, and I think also that, you know, figuring out a way to explain that these radical politics matter because they help us tell a story about policing also made the story legible to other audiences, right? Because again, these are a complicated set of politics. When I teach material like this to my students, you know, it's really a question I try and invite folks to think, like, who's at the center and how does that voice change how we understand larger movements, how we understand the way we interact with police, like things of that nature. And so really trying to think carefully as that this is an opportunity to bring those stories to life.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really rich. Moving forward, I'm curious about nationalism as a tool for resistance. Like when I first think of nationalism, I think about how it can be a tool for systems of power, for silencing, like, you know, in the United States, who's considered an American or a patriot, quote unquote. And in my own context with, as a child of Cuban immigrants in the context of Cuba, which is also complex. And if you want to hear more about that, we did a panel on the last year called Healing Memoria, so look that up. But in that context, you know, Patria o Muerte, country or death, was popular in the '59 revolution and is still used today, and something critiqued by leftist Cubans on the island and diasporic communities. And now it's become Patria y Vida, country and life, of like in these protests of, you know, for freedom and food as they express it. And so in both of these examples, you can see how nationalism can be a tool to silence and isolate people, which is what I'm more familiar with.
Absolutely.
I'm curious about, and this will be for Dr. Yara as well, I'm curious about Puerto Rico and Palestine, where we see nationalism as a tool to counter this consolidation of a story, one story and power, and rather using it as a tool for resistance and imagination. So Dr. Awartani, you can start us off, and then we'll go to Dr. Yada.
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. I'll try and answer quickly. I don't know, what comes to mind as I think about one, the fact that this is a group, this is a story I'm telling through a group of Puerto Ricans out of Chicago, right? So who are not necessarily always legible as Puerto Ricans in the same way. And that was something I really tried to think about, especially as an undergrad, as I'm like trying to figure out myself, right? Like, what does it mean to be attempting to lead this mass uprising of Puerto Ricans, but you are from the diaspora community, right? So that's part of the way I had initially, if you there's again an essay I've published where I go back to my own archives and I'm like talking about what it would mean to how Puerto Ricans and Palestinians in the diaspora in the United States are positioning themselves as spokesmen for the nation, I think is the way I phrase it. And then how part of the reason that they're marginalized and called terrorists is part of a marginalization of their place to even claim and be part of the Puerto Rican nation. Anyway, so that's an attempt at an answer. And then I also just think about the ways that they, again, in the tradition of the Puerto Rican nationalists, were really thinking about their actions as armed propaganda, right? Like a way to show the world in this very performative action, like you said, a counter narrative that there is actually that Puerto Rico is actually a colony, like at the very base level. So that's my attempt at some answers.
Yeah, Dr. Yara, would you like to jump in on that too? Just how, this nationalism as a tool for resistance has affected or grounded your work or the solidarity work of people in Palestine or Puerto Rico today.
Both and. Yeah, so thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Awartani, and just very rich. And one of the things that I'm thinking about as you're talking, not just about nationalism, but the recollection of all these histories. So I have I would say my upbringing was very particular in terms of I grew up in the political left in Puerto Rico. And so I would go to school, but also receive the counter history from my family and from my relatives in terms of saying, this is the official national anthem, but this used to be the national anthem. And they're very different because they have a political, social history around colonization, right? So I learned what a colony was when I was 6 years old, when I asked what the word meant. And my godmother gave me a very appropriate definition for a 6-year-old. She asked me to recall one of my cousin's dollhouse, and she said, "You like Daphne's dollhouse, right?" I'm like, "Yes, I love Daphne's dollhouse." Well, colonization is if you take the keys to her house and you tell her when and how to use it. And I would look at her and it's like, "That's not fair." And she's like, "Exactly, that's what a colony is, right?" But that was, how to teach abstract concept in a very concrete way. And so I say this to the way that I've experienced social movements and the way that I've experienced movements of solidarity and liberation, very few loud voices, right? In terms of the pockets of the people who are resisting. And I think that the work that you're doing, Dr. Awartani, in terms of recording that thread is very important, because what power does is, and oppression does, is to make you feel that you're isolated and that you're alone in the struggle, and that there's no history, that there's no accumulation of movement and of thrust towards somewhere or something. And so I think about that type of visibility and why then nationalism is such an important tool. And not just the idea or the construction of it, but what it emboldens, right? And all these words can go into positive or negative spectrum, right? But in terms of how they also record history. So I'm thinking about La Calle Resistencia in Old San Juan, which didn't used to be La Calle Resistencia until the Resistance Street, until 2019, where Puerto Ricans, islanders, and people who were diasporicans, like everybody went onto that street to demand the governor's, what's the word that I'm looking for that y'all know, but I can't remember right now. His resignation.
Yeah.
And so they changed the name of the street to La Calle Resistencia, and now it's like it's a physical record of memory and of history. and what it meant to come together, right? What it means to, and also part of, the history of how these movements are also very much the way that Puerto Rican identity has been articulated, at least, in my experience and what I know, Puerto Rican identity has been articulated either in the island or outside, is as a response to oppression and erasure of memory and of being. Even in the 1930s, and when the literature around what it meant to be Puerto Rican was coming out, in that generation of literature. And so I think that it's a both and in terms of how it can be used, or maybe thinking about how people who are have binational identity, even in the island or in the States, kind of like negotiating what that means. But that they're not only Puerto Ricans in the island, right? There are people that are coming. There's a big Dominican population, a big Colombian population, people from other places in the world. And so what does it mean? The question that I ask myself in terms of what does it mean to be in a solidarity in the way that you were talking about, in terms of how the struggles are linked, that it's not about sameness, but it's about being linked. And I'm completely trailing off and continuing with the thought because I had just a lot of thoughts as you were speaking. But then I think about how solidarity in Spanish is almost ontological, because there's no, to my knowledge, word that in English that talks about ser solidario. And you say being in solidarity, but you're not solidarity. And in Spanish, you are solidarity, right? So it's a way of embodying, it's a way of being that is not just an action, but a way of being and being with each other. And so I think about Nawa and you are my other me, and I think about Ubuntu and I am because of you. And so the ways that I think what, at least for me, is easy to, because of my upbringing, because we would go after going to church, grew up Catholic, after going to church, we would go to a protest. That was like, the procession was that, right? Like the ritual was that. So it was very seamless to me. But thinking about how to be in solidarity with people that are from other places and that are facing other struggles, at least when I think about it in Spanish, right? It's not difficult because it is a way of being. And so I think about Cuban theologian Ada Maria Isasi Diaz, when she talks about solidarity, and how solidarity is not about being in agreement with somebody else. That's not what being in solidarity. It means about being with somebody, walking with somebody, and accompanying them. And so you can still have your own identity and you are your own person, but it is more of a weaved kind of practice of being in the world.
Thank you for that. Yeah, there's so much in there. I think zooming in as we're talking about nationalism and then kind of individual stories in this vein of collective identity, so much of the time what mass violence or genocide, occupation, colonial rule does is it tries to erase the nuance or the stories or the particularities that we have in our varied experiences of what it means to be X or Y. And so I want to ask that specifically, which Dr. Yada, you were already alluding to some things. Dr. Awartani, would you share any particular stories or rituals as a Puerto Rican Palestinian American person that speaks to, what is special and important to you about these identities outside of just how you are, taken in by the outside world? Or, it could be as simple as favorite meals or a particular elder or cultural memories that you have.
That's a good question. That's a hard question. I think one thing that comes to mind is I interviewed this one activist who lived in Chicago, is now, or at the time was in Puerto Rico, and she was telling me a story of how she learned how to make a Palestinian dish from her friends who were Palestinians in Puerto Rico. And she's the one who taught me how to make this dish. I didn't know how to make it. My father's a Palestinian one. He is Um, let's say not a cook. He has particular ideas of how to cook a meal, and if you don't cook it right, it's a whole thing. So I tended to avoid doing that kind of learning those kinds of rituals growing up. But she taught me how to make it, and she sent me the recipe, and I was like, this is a moment. This is like such a moment of the work that I'm doing, right? That we have all these shared rituals between communities, and this is how I learn of how to make this meal that's so integral to the Palestinian community. And I found that to just be really beautiful. And that has set, and it was during, like kind of the hardcore COVID times. I was by myself, and here was this elder who I had met just to do this kind of research, and who had shared a part of like her life to enrich my own. And so that has always sat with me really beautifully. But then I also think of just kind of, I was speaking with some grad students on Monday, and we were talking about what it might mean to write against exceptionalism. And so just to embody kind of two identities who are tied to these political situations, which are somehow unsolvable or framed as unsolvable. And to just know that existing as this person is itself resistance, right? And then on top of that, to do this work and tell these histories, precisely counters that narrative that tells us that, Puerto Rico is the Puerto Rico status question. It's somehow devoid from any other context. And Palestine is the Palestine problem. And it's, again, somehow devoid from any other context. And what I love and what I'm so glad to have become a movement historian is that counters that, right? And it's not just me making the comparisons. I didn't have to figure out the categories in which to compare Puerto Rico and Palestine, because people in the past had already done that work and attempted to make those comparisons. And so, what do comparisons show us about ourselves, about communities, and again, also about the way that the state operates and how it's understanding how we're trying to demand liberation.
Thank you for that. Dr. Gonzalez Justiniano. I always want to say Dr. Yara, but you have a whole, title, Dr. Gonzalez Justiniano. Same question. You were alluding to how solidarity has been woven into your family. But how it functioned in your youth and family as a Puerto Rican person, how it informs your work today.
Yeah, I mean, so I think about, it doesn't function in a mess or a chaos. Like I can see how the lines and threads are there. And so I think that for me, what it does, and I can obviously speak more practically this, but what it does is that it forces me to sit and think about it harder and longer. And so because it has to be, so I thought about what Dr. Awartani was saying in terms of, write a story that is meaningful, and a story that is important. And I think that being in spaces that value productivity in a particular kind of way, and that meaning or meaningfulness has a different way of understanding and being capitalized than what it actually is life-giving. And so I think that what it just makes my job harder. I think that that's the bottom line in terms of being in these spaces and then still creating something that is meaningful. But what it does in that kind of work is, I think that for me, is just develop a particular sensibility on how to approach the work. And so I think a lot about the different ways and movements around liberation theology, and how I always give the example of Enrique Dussel, who talks about being in communities of communication, and kind of part of a principle is to remember that there's always somebody that's outside of that circle of communication. And so even if you don't always know who that person is or who that group is or what that issue is, to know that there's room to be made for that. And this is something that also, like in social movement theory, they talk about in terms of the unknowns of the movement that continue giving it the movement, right? Like that it is, that doesn't petrify the event, or it doesn't petrify the issue, but creates its expansion. And so for me, what it does is to both tackle the anxiety of having to put something into paper And when it's put into paper, it is sort of petrified, right? And this thing that has no more movement. And that's why I say, like, in terms of that, that's what makes the job harder, because I am having to recreate something or plasmar something that needs to have or has a life in its own. So for me, it's the question of how to create something that has a continuity, that ages well in terms of doing that. And for me, is the remembering of the stories and being able to craft things that allow for that expansion or that mistake making or that the things that I am not ignorant of, for example. And so how do I incorporate that already in my work? And so I think about how to create designs or design thinking or writing that is follows a linear reading of it, but it's constantly revising itself in praxis, and it's constantly revising itself and having a circular kind of or spiral understanding of being and organizing life. So even I'm assuming, right, as a historian, as you're like dividing or tracing a timeline, that it is not linear, right? There are things that are happening and are moving and impacting that timeline in different ways. So how to capture that in ways that are not just meaningful, but also life-giving and life-continuing, right? Going back to the patria y vida instead of a patria o muerte.
Yeah, thank you for that. We are at 2:30, but I do want to ask a closing question for Dr. Awartani. You know, I'm at a divinity school, and so I'm always interested in the spiritual aspects of people's experiences and their work, and what kind of sustains. I'm curious about what sustains the work you do in any spiritual dimensions, you know, not inherently religious necessarily, but the things that keep you going and ground you as you do this work at the intersection of these identities that, you know, are troubled by the colonial narrative or made a problem.
That's a good question, and that's a hard question. I think this conversation has made me think about the students I teach, right? And I think I have come to the realization in my first 2 years semi-tenure track line that, like, what I really care about is the teaching and, like, protecting myself for the longevity on the long haul of doing the work with undergraduate students, again, in the same way that I first encountered this work as an undergrad at a major state institution, which was the first time I was learning Latino history, all of these things, and recreating that dynamic in the classroom and creating the community I wanted in the classroom, where folks can walk in and admit what they don't know and talk about how they've progressed, the revisions of their ideas. But then I also think, you know, about the way the writing lives on, as you were just speaking to. Like, if you look at my early attempts at publications in grad school, like they're very jargony, they're very academic sounding. And as this work has evolved and I've met more people and really had to think seriously about who is inviting me to do this work, who is validating this work, that I've shifted the way I write, and I really try to write in a way that is not just accessible, but is, we had a visiting speaker who described writing as kind, right? Like, how do I write in a way that's kind, that makes you want to keep reading, that really is centering people's stories and not the kind of academic conversations that we're trained to write about in a graduate program, right? And I'll just kind of end with, I recently published an essay in Against the Current, which is a socialist magazine out of Detroit, and I got a letter, and I will try to not be emotional. I received a letter in my campus mailbox from a prisoner in Virginia who had said that, well, he was just like, I read your piece and I wanted to thank you for doing the work. And just like how full circle, right? And how much, the reminder of how much this actually means to communities on the ground, right? And that I'm not I sustain myself by reminding myself that I am not the ivory tower and I do not have to write for this. And it's not the center that I have to hold, even if I have to meet the metrics in order to stay in this space, right? But to like really remind myself that the students and the classroom and the work we create together to do movement work on a campus is what's sustainable. And the way that folks in the community or folks in prison are reading these stories and thinking about political education, that matters, right? So it's not kind of the accolades that can kind of sweep us up, but it's really the folks who are trying to do the movement work in the classroom and outside that keeps me going, because this is a rough career path.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's been a pleasure and an honor to host you today. Sorry we couldn't get to the questions for the folks that submitted questions in that line of like lineage and archive and those we have lost and the worlds we're working for. I want to read a poem to close, short. I'm sure a lot of us have heard it at this point, but it's If I Must Die by Rifat Alarir. And so we'll do this to close. If I must die, you must live to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings, make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze, and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is there bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope. Let it be a story. And with that, may we continue to tell these stories and gather together. And thank you so much for everyone joining us. Have a great rest of your day.